I flew 10 hours to surprise my family for Christmas, first time home in 3 years. No one picked me up, my seat was gone, and my aunt laughed. Didn't know ghosts got invites. My sister said, stay out of the photos. Even Dad whispered, just don't start anything. I just nodded and proclaimed, you won't see me again. 2 months later, I did something that set off a chain reaction. Last night, my mom called me crying. What did you do? I, 32M, hadn't been home in 3 years. Work had consumed my life, and honestly, I'd been avoiding the drama. But Christmas felt different this year. I wanted to surprise them, to show I still cared despite the distance. The flight from Singapore was brutal, 10 hours of cramped seats and airline food. I kept imagining their faces when I walked through the door. Mom would cry. Dad would probably give me that awkward half-hug he always did. My sister might actually smile for once. The airport was chaos. I waited at baggage claim for 40 minutes, checking my phone obsessively. No missed calls. No texts. I told them my flight number weeks ago in our family group chat, but maybe they forgot. I called Mom. Voicemail. Dad. Straight to voicemail. My sister didn't even have her phone on. An Uber cost me $80 to get home. The driver kept glancing at me in the mirror, probably wondering why someone looked so miserable on Christmas Eve. I stared out the window at familiar streets, decorated houses, families probably preparing for tomorrow. My stomach twisted with something I couldn't name. The house looked exactly the same. Dad's terrible string lights still hung crooked on the gutters. Mom's wreath was perfectly centered on the door. I could hear voices inside, laughter. My heart hammered as I rang the doorbell. My aunt opened it. Her face went through several expressions: confusion, recognition, then something that looked almost like annoyance. She called over her shoulder that I was here, like I was some uninvited salesman. Mom appeared, and for a second, I thought she might cry. Instead, she just looked tired. She asked why I hadn't called, why I didn't tell them I was coming. I reminded her about the texts, the flight information. She waved it off, said they'd been so busy preparing. The living room was packed. Extended family I barely recognized, neighbors, family friends. Everyone stared when I walked in with my suitcase. The dining table was set for exactly the number of people who were supposed to be there. There was no place for me. My sister glanced up from her phone and said something about not knowing I was coming. When I mentioned the group chat again, she shrugged and said she never checks it. Dad appeared from the kitchen, beer in hand, and told me to find somewhere to sit. The couch was full. The folding chairs were all occupied. I stood there like an idiot, suitcase in hand, while conversations slowly resumed around me. My aunt made some comment about not knowing ghosts got invites, and a few people chuckled. I felt my face burn. During dinner, I sat on a stool from the kitchen, plate balanced on my knees while everyone else had proper seating. My sister took photos constantly, family shots, cousin shots, group shots. Every time I moved into frame, she'd wave me away. She said something about keeping the photos clean, just immediate family and close relatives. I wasn't close enough anymore, apparently. Dad pulled me aside later while everyone was watching Christmas movies. He told me not to start anything, not to make scenes. Just enjoy being home. When I asked what I'd done wrong, he said nothing, but his tone suggested otherwise. I went to bed in my childhood room, except it wasn't anymore. It was Dad's office now. I slept on an air mattress between filing cabinets and exercise equipment that was never used. Christmas morning was worse. Gift exchange happened before I woke up. Mom said they didn't want to wake me since I was probably jet-lagged. I watched everyone open presents I hadn't known to buy, gave gifts that felt awkward and unwelcome. My aunt made another ghost comment. My cousin's kid asked Mom who I was. She said I was someone who used to live there. That afternoon, I made my announcement. I told them they wouldn't see me again. Not like this. Not as someone they barely tolerated. Mom tried to protest, said I was being dramatic. Dad just looked relieved. I flew back to Singapore the next day, 48 hours after arriving. The return ticket cost me $3,000. For 2 months, I grieved. Not just the trip, but everything. The family I thought I had, the home that was no longer mine, the relationships that had apparently died without my noticing. I went through old photos, messages, trying to understand when I'd become the stranger. Then I got angry. I started with the family business. Dad had put me on some paperwork years ago, back when he trusted me with financial decisions. I'd forgotten about it until I started digging through old documents. Apparently, so had he. The construction company had been struggling. I knew this from Christmas conversations I'd overheard. Cash flow problems, delayed payments from contractors, the usual small business nightmares. What I didn't know was how bad it had gotten. I made some calls. My friend from university worked in commercial real estate now, had connections with major developers. He mentioned they were looking for reliable contractors for a massive project, shopping complex, residential towers, the works. 3-year contract, guaranteed payments, enough to save any struggling construction business. I set up the meeting, flew back to the States under the pretense of business travel. Didn't tell anyone I was coming. The developers loved Dad's portfolio. His crew had good reviews, reasonable prices, and they needed someone local. By the end of the week, they'd verbally committed to the contract. Then I made another call. I told them about the financial instability, the missed payments to suppliers I discovered through public records, the lawsuit from 2 years ago that Dad had settled quietly, the tax liens that were public information once you knew where to look. I didn't lie. Everything I told them was true, documented, verifiable. I just connected dots they hadn't bothered to connect themselves. They pulled out. But that wasn't enough. My sister worked for a marketing firm that primarily served local businesses. Small accounts, nothing major, but steady income. She'd been trying to land bigger clients, had mentioned it constantly during Christmas conversations. I knew people in marketing. Singapore had connected me with international networks Dad and my sister couldn't imagine. I made introductions, recommended her agency for some consultancy work with Asian companies looking to expand into American markets. Then I made other calls, asked questions about her work quality, her reliability, mentioned concerns about cultural sensitivity, about whether someone from a small town could really understand international markets. 2 of her biggest potential clients chose other agencies. But I was just getting started. Mom volunteered at the community center, organized events, managed fundraising for local charities. She was proud of this work, had built her identity around being the reliable one, the organizer everyone could count on. I donated anonymously to 3 of her favorite charities. Large enough donations that they invited me to board meetings, asked for my input on future events. I suggested fresh perspectives, younger leadership, new approaches to fundraising. Then I shared concerns about current management, suggested they might benefit from outside consultants, professional event planners, people with broader experience. Mom lost 2 committee positions she'd held for 8 years. The beauty was that none of it looked connected. Business deals fall through. Clients choose other firms. Organizations restructure. These things happen in small towns, just like everywhere else. I waited. Last night, Mom called. It was 3 in the morning my time, which meant she was desperate enough to forget about time zones entirely. She was crying before I could say hello. She asked what I'd done, demanded to know how I'd ruined everything. The family business was failing. My sister had lost her biggest accounts. The community center board had basically pushed Mom out. She said Dad suspected but couldn't prove anything. That my sister was asking questions about my friends, my connections, whether I had the kind of influence they were seeing. She begged me to fix it. Said she was sorry about Christmas, that they'd all been sorry but didn't know how to reach out. She promised things would be different if I came home again. I let her cry, let her apologize, let her promise changes she'd never actually make. Then I told her the truth, that I hadn't done anything illegal, hadn't lied about anyone, hadn't sabotaged anything directly. I'd simply shared information, made connections, offered perspectives that people found valuable. I explained that this was what consequences looked like, that treating family like strangers had stranger-level repercussions, that if they wanted professional relationships with me, they'd get professional-level consideration for their interests. Mom asked what I wanted, how she could fix this. I told her I wanted exactly what I'd received at Christmas. Nothing. No special treatment. No family privileges. No expectations of loyalty or support. They'd made it clear I wasn't really family anymore, so I was simply accepting that reality and responding accordingly. She said that wasn't what they meant, that I was being cruel. I reminded her about the ghost comments, the photo exclusions, the air mattress between filing cabinets. Asked her to explain the difference between what they'd done and what I was doing now. She couldn't. Update 1. Dad called this morning. No tears, just anger. He accused me of destroying everything out of spite, said I was acting like a child throwing a tantrum. I asked him if he'd figured out how I'd done it. He admitted he hadn't, but he knew it was me somehow. The timing was too convenient, the problems too specific. He demanded I fix everything. Not asked, demanded. I told him I'd consider it the same way he'd considered my place at Christmas dinner. With exactly the level of priority he'd given my presence in their lives. He threatened to cut me off completely. I reminded him he'd already done that. You can't lose something you never had. My sister texted later. Much more strategic approach. She acknowledged they'd handled Christmas poorly, said they'd been dealing with family stress I didn't know about. She offered to visit Singapore to rebuild our relationship properly. I appreciated the effort. It was more than anyone else had managed. But I told her rebuilding required acknowledging what had been broken, and I wasn't sure any of them understood that yet. She asked what it would take, what she needed to do to make things right. I sent her a simple message. Treat me like family, and I'll respond like family. Treat me like a stranger, and you'll get stranger-level consideration. The choice had always been theirs. Update 2. 3 weeks later, things escalated. My uncle called, Dad's brother, who I'd always gotten along with. He said the whole extended family was talking, trying to understand what had happened. Some sided with me, said Christmas had been embarrassing to watch. Others thought I was overreacting, that family was supposed to forgive. He asked for my side of the story. I told him everything, from the ignored messages to the ghost comments to sleeping on an air mattress in what used to be my room. I explained about feeling invisible, unwelcome, like a burden they tolerated rather than family they'd missed. My uncle was quiet for a long time. Then he said he'd noticed but hadn't realized how bad it was. He apologized for not speaking up, for letting it happen. That conversation changed something. Word spread through the extended family network the way it does in small towns. Suddenly people were taking sides, asking questions, remembering details they'd overlooked at the time. Mom called again, more desperate this time. The community center situation had gotten worse. Other volunteers were questioning her judgment, her ability to handle responsibility. She'd lost her position as fundraising coordinator for the annual charity auction, something she'd run for 12 years. She said people were asking why her own son wouldn't support her causes anymore, why someone with my apparent connections had turned against his own family. It was becoming public, embarrassing in a way that small-town gossip could be devastating. I felt a flicker of something that might have been guilt. Then I remembered Christmas morning, watching them exchange gifts like I wasn't there, feeling like a ghost in my own childhood home. Dad's business was struggling more seriously now. Word had gotten out about the failed contract, and other potential clients were being cautious. Credit was tightening. He'd had to lay off 2 employees, including someone who'd worked for him for 8 years. My sister had found new clients, smaller accounts, but the momentum she'd been building was gone. She'd had to take a part-time job to supplement her income. None of them were facing real hardship yet. They weren't losing their homes or going hungry. But the comfortable middle-class stability they'd taken for granted was shaking, and they didn't understand how to fix it. That's when my cousin reached out. Dad's sister's daughter, someone I'd barely interacted with growing up, but who'd been at Christmas. She said she'd been thinking about that night, about how I'd looked standing there with my suitcase while everyone stared. She said it had bothered her then, but she hadn't known how to respond. Family dynamics were complicated, and she'd assumed there was context she didn't understand. Now she was wondering if the context was simpler than she'd thought. If I'd just been someone who'd traveled 10 hours to surprise people who didn't want to be surprised. Her message was different from the others. No demands, no accusations, no bargaining. Just acknowledgement that what had happened was wrong, and recognition that consequences sometimes take time to arrive. She said she'd talked to her mom, my aunt, the one who'd made the ghost comments. Apparently, she'd been feeling guilty about it, had tried to bring it up with Dad several times. He'd shut down those conversations, said I was being oversensitive. That family was supposed to be able to joke with each other. My cousin asked if there was a way forward. Not back to how things were, because clearly that hadn't been working, but towards something better. I told her I appreciated her reaching out, that her perspective meant more than she probably realized. But I also explained that I wasn't interested in being the one who fixed this. I tried to connect with them, had been rejected, and now they wanted me to solve the problems that rejection had created. If they wanted a relationship, they needed to figure out how to build one, not how to manipulate me into rebuilding what they'd torn down. Update 3. Yesterday, something shifted. Mom showed up in Singapore. I came home from work to find her sitting in my building's lobby, looking exhausted and overwhelmed. She'd been traveling for 26 hours, had never left the country before, didn't speak any of the local languages. She looked so small sitting there with her suitcase, completely out of her element. For a moment, I was 12 years old again, coming home from school to find her waiting with snacks and questions about my day. Then I remembered Christmas, and the moment passed. She followed me up to my apartment without asking permission, looked around at my life with wide eyes, at the space I'd built for myself halfway around the world. She commented on how clean it was, how organized, like she'd expected me to be living in chaos without their influence. She said she'd come to understand, to see what I'd built, what I'd chosen instead of them. We sat at my kitchen table, the one I'd bought myself, in the apartment I'd furnished myself, in the life I'd created myself. She asked me to explain everything again, from the beginning, so she could understand where it had gone wrong. I told her about the years of feeling like an afterthought, about calls that went unreturned, messages that got brief replies, visits home where I felt like I was intruding on their real lives. I explained that Christmas hadn't been the beginning of the problem. It had just been the moment I'd finally seen it clearly. She cried again, but differently this time. Not the desperate crying of someone trying to fix a crisis, but the deeper grief of someone recognizing real loss. She admitted they'd gotten used to me being gone, that my success had made them feel like I didn't need them anymore, like I'd outgrown the family somehow. She said they'd been proud but also intimidated, hadn't known how to relate to someone whose life was so different from theirs. She said Dad felt like he'd lost the right to give me advice, that my sister felt like I judged their choices, that they'd all started treating me like a visitor instead of family, because they'd forgotten how to do anything else. I asked her why it had taken losing everything for her to realize this. Why my feelings hadn't mattered until there were consequences that affected them. She didn't have a good answer for that. We talked through the night. She asked about my life, really asked, in a way no one had in years. About my work, my friends, what I did for fun, whether I was happy. She listened to answers without trying to fix anything or offer advice I hadn't requested. She told me about home, about the real problems behind the Christmas chaos. Dad's business had been struggling for 2 years. My sister had been dealing with anxiety issues, had been trying to appear more successful than she was. The extended family gathering had been partly about maintaining appearances, about pretending everything was fine when nothing was. She said they'd been so focused on managing their own problems that they'd forgotten I might have problems too. That the successful son in Singapore might still need his family, might still want to belong somewhere. This morning, she asked what it would take to fix this. Not the business problems or the community issues, but the family itself. I told her it wasn't about fixing anymore. It was about building something new, something that acknowledged who we all actually were instead of who we used to be or thought we should be. She asked how we do that. I said it starts with honesty. About what we want from each other, what we can actually offer, what our real limitations and expectations are. No more pretending, no more assuming, no more taking anything for granted. She nodded and said she'd talk to Dad and my sister. Not to demand they apologize or change, but to start the conversation about what kind of family we actually want to be. I told her I'd consider coming home for Easter. Not for a surprise visit, not to fix their problems, but to see if we could sit at the same table and actually see each other. She's flying back tomorrow. I drove her to some of the places I love here, showed her the life I've built, introduced her to friends who've become chosen family. She met the people who've supported me through difficult times, who celebrate my successes without feeling threatened by them. She said she understood now why I'd stayed away, that I'd found something here they hadn't been able to give me. But she also said she hoped we could learn to give it to each other, even across the distance. I told her I hoped so too. The revenge had felt satisfying for a while. Watching consequences catch up to people who'd treated me carelessly had provided a sense of justice I'd needed. But sitting with Mom in my apartment, seeing her try to understand the life I'd built without them, I realized what I actually wanted. I wanted family. Real family. People who chose to know me, support me, celebrate with me not out of obligation but out of genuine care. Whether that could happen with the people who shared my genetics remained to be seen. But for the first time in years, it felt like a possibility worth exploring. The chain reaction I'd started was still rippling outward. But maybe some of those ripples could carry something better than just consequences. Maybe they could carry change. We'll see what Easter brings.